right here, this guy in the black robe in the town square, this is the guy who won the war. This is who really ticked off the British. These are the guys they hated more than anybody else. So we're going to talk a bit about why and the history of that and some inspiring stories that we're going to hear. So in colonial America, the churches were the center of American society. And so they were in a unique position of influence. So this is a quick little 2-minute trailer to kind of warm you up to what we're going to be talking about.
There was a time when the Christian church in America led out in the defense of liberty. The 18th century church was, for all practical purposes, the center of American society. Now, this placed the pastors of that period in a unique position of influence. What they believed and what they preached had a significant impact on the people around them. Every Sunday, they preached these principles in their congregations wearing their black robes. And when the time came, many of those pastors led the men of those congregations off to fight for and some to die for those very principles. This is the story of some of those patriot preachers, men the British called the Black Robe Regiment.
And so everything that I'm going to cover in this presentation is a very well documented concept. It's this idea that the ministers won the war for the revolution is widely documented yet not taught in public schools and barely understood by most people in American society. But this is just to kind of show you, these are a lot of the books that I went through. I've got a few sample books up here afterwards if you want to see. One in particular, this one is really amazing. I quote her probably one of the most in this presentation, The New England Pulpit and the American Revolution. So this idea, this is a very old idea that goes back to our scriptures that we tend to read here in Utah. In 3 Nephi 3:19, it says, "Now it was appointed the custom of all the Nephites to appoint for their chief captains someone that had the spirit of revelation and also prophecy." So even in war, the little regiments, the small groups they had, and the Nephites in times of righteousness, they chose somebody that could have been equivalent to like the minister back in the American Revolution, someone that they looked up to, who had studied scripture. So one major takeaway for tonight is that the British credited the ministers for causing the rebellion and winning the American War for independence. A few examples of where we see this in the historical literature. This author, Alice Baldwin, she wrote about in 1928, she wrote this book, The New England Pulpit and the American Revolution. It said the Black Regiment, or the Black Robe Regiment, was the name that the British placed on the courageous and patriotic American clergy during the founding era. So it was the enemies of the Americans that were kind of like those black-robed, right? It was kind of a backhanded comment. 1854, another author said the same thing. Significantly, the British blamed the Black Regiment for American independence. And so there's something for us to learn about why they blamed the ministers and why they felt so emotional about it, right? Giving them this nickname that they saw kind of as a negative. King George said he called the American Revolution a Presbyterian rebellion. another British official says, "There's no use crying about it. Cousin America has eloped with a Presbyterian parson." A supporter of King George III said, "I fix all the blame for these extraordinary proceedings upon the Presbyterians. They have been the chief and principal instruments in all these flaming measures." And then the British had hired, the Hessians. They were the German soldiers for hire. And so a Hessian captain pointed out, "Call this war by whatever name you may, it is nothing more or less than a Presbyterian rebellion." So we have, a pretty good foundation there that the British were really blaming the ministers, the churches, and when they say Presbyterian, it's kind of because that was the opposite of the Anglican Church, which was the Church of England. So let's tell a story. I've got a few stories throughout this presentation. A lot of good. These stories, for me, they really inspire me as far as understanding how all this happened and why it is important today. So, British loyalists versus the ministers. There was this man named Peter Oliver. He was the chief judge of Massachusetts that was on the side of the British king. And James Otis was a Massachusetts legislator and activist. So he organized the ministers. So he was on the colonial side. And this was at the time of something that was called the Stamp Act. The Parliament of Great Britain was working on this act that was a direct tax against the British colonies, making them buy printed materials that had special stamped paper. So it was just a way to tax the colonies and, make money, force them to, choose their products and so forth. During this time, these two are kind of battling it out. Peter Oliver was complaining about this guy, James Otis. Peter said he hated the dissenting ministers, or the henchmen of James Otis. Peter Oliver said, "Otis saw from the beginning the necessity of securing the Black Regiment if he were to rouse the people. So he observed that James's strategy was to get the people motivated. He went to the ministers. James Otis ensured support of the leading Boston clergy who had planted the principles of liberty in the people." Peter Oliver called it, and this time he said the black-coated order, right? Another name. He said, "Like their predecessors of 1641, have been unceasingly sounding the yell of rebellion in the ears of the people." He recognized that the ministers, they were planting these principles in their congregations, and that he was even referencing this has been going on for a very long time. So he's going back 100 years to 1641. And it's interesting that he chooses, the yell of rebellion, right? Well, can you imagine hearing in a church today the yell of rebellion against the tyrannical things that the state is doing? But yet here, this is the foundation of what made us a country. Another takeaway we have here is that the ministers taught and prepared the people. So to just kind of back up that concept a little bit more, we'll go back to this lady, Alice Baldwin. She pointed out, "There is not a single right asserted in the Declaration of Independence which had not been discussed by the New England clergy before 1763. The Constitutional Convention and the written Constitution were children of the pulpit." So we owe all of our founding documents to the fact that the ministers felt the call to teach liberty to their congregations all throughout the colonies. John Adams stated, "The pulpits have thundered," in referring to this situation. The ministers were the characters most conspicuous and influential in awakening a revival of American principles and feelings of liberty. As a body of men, the clergy were preeminent in their attachment to liberty. The pulpits of the land rang with the notes of freedom. If Christian ministers had not preached and prayed, there might have been no revolution as yet, or had it broken out, it might have been crushed. The ministers of the Revolution were bold and fearless in the cause of their country. No class of men contributed more to carry forward the revolution and to achieve our independence than did the ministers. So in 1843, this monument was erected. This is a monument on Bunker Hill. And Daniel Webster spoke. So this is we're like 70, 80 years after the revolution or something like that. And he spoke and he said, to the free and universal reading of the Bible in that age, men were much indebted for right views of civil liberty. So a whole lot of historical evidence that the teachings of the ministers laid this foundation among the culture. The culture was thick with the love of the freedom of their fellow man. And they'd been taught by their religious leaders, so they knew it was righteous. And their ministers knew the scriptures. And so it was just the perfect foundation of doing the right thing. In addition to just teaching, the ministers, they also led the fighting, oftentimes. They led the fight, and they were considered the greatest threat by Britain. So, let's talk about some stories of ministers that were leading the fight. I've got a few clips from another gentleman who had talked about this subject about 8 years ago, and so I just have a few clips from his speech. He tells these stories really well, so we're going to show a few of those. The first minister of the colonial era was a guy by the name of John Muhlenberg.
Now I want to begin with this man, John Muhlenberg. John Muhlenberg was a pastor in Trapp, Pennsylvania, and then he had moved to Woodstock, Virginia. And he had struggled for quite some time with the conflict between the colonies and the crown. He was convinced that the crown was tyrannous and that the colonists should stand up and fight. And so Muhlenberg, after having fully persuaded himself in his mind that this is what God wanted him to do, climbed into his pulpit on January the 21st, 1776, and he proceeded to preach from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Now, most of you are probably familiar that Ecclesiastes 3 says that there's a time for all things. And then he read verse 8, which says there is a time of war and a time of peace. And then he did something that his people didn't expect. He closed his Bible and he said, there is a time for all things, a time to preach, and there is a time to pray. But there's also a time to fight, and that time has now come. And then he stepped out of his pulpit, walked to the back of his auditorium, and he did something that they'd never seen happen in all of the years that they had attended church in this church in Woodstock, Virginia, because he began to remove his clerical robe. And underneath his clerical robe, he had on a colonial officer's uniform. Muhlenberg had been commissioned by George Washington to raise a regiment from the Woodstock, Virginia area. And so he stood before his men and he took his musket and he said, men, it is now time to fight for liberty. He had already preached and prepared his people for this moment. They knew what this was all about. And as I said, he walked to the back of his auditorium. As he opened the door to his church, a drummer began to play a roll, and Muhlenberg stood there with his musket urging his men to enlist, and they did. In fact, the next day he led a number of men from Woodstock, Virginia off to war. He led them for the entire war. In fact, by the war's end, Muhlenberg had become such a decorated general that he had been promoted to Major General. He led those men in battles, as you can see, Morristown, Brandywine, Monmouth Courthouse. He became one of Washington's most trusted generals and was actually honored with the privilege of being at the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. This is the famous painting in our nation's rotunda. And if you will look right over here, that third man seated on a horse is John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. He was a pastor who set aside his clerical robes and believed that you sometimes need to put boot leather to the Bible. And that's exactly what he did. He became representative of all of these Black Robe Regiment preachers. Today, in Statuary Hall in our capital, you can see a statue placed there by the state of Pennsylvania, and notice Muhlenberg's clerical robe is hanging over his right arm, and he's holding his sword with his left. Now, this is what the Black Robe Regiment was all about. These pastors believed that civil and religious liberties are connected, and they led their people to join the fight. But it was all throughout the colonies, not just in Pennsylvania and Virginia.
You see how he emphasized in the end, these pastors believe that civil and religious liberties are connected. If anyone is fighting for their religious freedom, it will never work unless they holistically understand their civil liberties as well. This next story, James Caldwell, this is again also very inspiring. You really see how this Reverend James Caldwell took it upon himself to lead his men and solve the problems that they ran into. So we'll do this one.
Now here's another Black Robe preacher. This is not a Lutheran, this is a Presbyterian. I mentioned him earlier. His name is James Caldwell. He was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Now this guy was a character. Every Sunday, Caldwell would walk into his pulpit wearing two pistols like this. And when he got to the pulpit, he would pull them out and place the pistols on the pulpit, preach. When he was finished, take the pistols, hook them back in his belt, walk to the back of the church and greet his members. Now that's the kind of guy that Caldwell was. He believed that pastors must stand for truth, not just in their pulpits, but in their communities and if need be on the battlefield. He was actually hated by the British. As you can see, he was called the rebel high priest and the high priest of the rebellion. Well, his wife was killed when a British soldier shot into their house, and Caldwell actually did his wife's funeral. Well, after the funeral, the war had moved to Springfield, New Jersey, so he jumped on his horse after leaving his children in the care of some of the townspeople, and he went to lead his men at Springfield, New Jersey. When he got there, the soldiers were running out of wadding for their muskets. Now, if you know anything about these flintlock muskets, you know that without wadding, you can't use these things. So what were they going to do? They were going to be defeated simply because they didn't have wadding. So he jumped back on his horse, rode down to the First Presbyterian Church of Springfield. When he went down to that church, he grabbed 2 armloads of hymn books. He came riding back to his men, and this painting depicts it. He started throwing the hymn books at the men, encouraging them to tear the pages out and use the pages for wadding. Now, in that day, a very famous hymn writer was a writer by the name of Isaac Watts. And so as he was throwing the books to them, he was yelling them, "Give them Watts, boys, give them Watts." And that's where the old saying that we use today, "Give them what for?" that's where that comes from. It comes from the Presbyterian black robe preacher, James Caldwell, as he's throwing hymn books at his men, telling them to use the pages for wadding. So that gives you a little glimpse into these preachers.
I think that's awesome. That's such a fun story. And I just discovered there's just dozens and dozens of stories of all these preachers and the things that they went through. So I'm kind of going to go through a number of them here. British attack on the left. British Governor Edmund Andros, just someone under the King George, tried to seize the charters of Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, revoke their representative governments, and force the British Anglican Church on them. 2 reverends, Samuel Willard and John Wise, led the opposition in those cases. John Wise went to prison for his resistance, just like the apostles in the book of Acts went to prison for doing the right thing. Another British attack. Berkeley refused to recognize A British governor, Berkeley, refused to recognize Virginia's self-government. Opposition led by Quaker minister William Edmondson and Reverend Thomas Harrison. Another example, Governor Thomas Hutchinson, British governor, ignored the elected Massachusetts legislature. Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper led a rebellion against him. 3 different examples. A British governor dissolving New Hampshire legislature, the Virginia House of Burgesses, and the Georgia Assembly. All of these, the British Crown just kept trying to say, we don't recognize your self-government. We're going to impose our rule on you. And there's always a consistent pattern of ministers always leading the opposition with sermons and actions, both. And it's in all those books that I showed you in the beginning. The Boston Massacre, the British opened fire on their own citizens in this famous event. 3 different sermons I came across that were given. Reverend John Lanthrop, Reverend Charles Chauncey, and Reverend Samuel Cook. They read the sermons, fired their people up, and led revolts against the British Crown. And it was the ministers who first started saying, let's become our own country. Let's separate. Again, they're teaching this from the pulpit. They're telling their people this is righteous, this is right, and using doctrine and truth to explain it so that people gain a testimony of it. So this is great. The Paul Revere story. Everybody has heard the story of Paul Revere. Right? The British are coming. But most people, that's about all they hear, right? The ride of Paul Revere, the horse. There's been a few cartoons. You kind of see that. But the rest of the story is really awesome. This plaque is on the home where at first lived Reverend John Hancock, and then afterwards also lived Reverend Jonas Clark. It was at the night of Paul Revere's ride that Samuel Adams and John Hancock were sleeping there when Paul Revere came by and awoke them, saying the British are coming. So in this story, when Paul Revere set off on his famous ride, his destination was the home of Reverend Jonas Clark in Lexington. John Hancock, Samuel Adams were sleeping, as they often did with Reverend Clark. So you can kind of imagine these are like the key founding fathers of our nation. They trusted their ministers. They lodged with them. Right? It was the center of their life in many ways, especially in these trying times. That was the kind of relationship they had with these men. After Paul Revere told them of the approaching British forces, John Hancock and Samuel Adams turned to their pastor. They asked him, are the people ready to fight? The Reverend Clark said, I have trained them for this very hour. Another perspective on the same story from this other author. When the original alarm sounded in Lexington to warn of the oncoming British menace, okay, so this is now after the last story I just mentioned, the citizens gathered together, kind of in the town center, right, the town green. There they found their pastor, Reverend Clark, who had arrived before them. So the pastor is leading the way. Their minister, who they trusted, is leading the way. The roll was called, and 150 members of his congregation answered their names. That's like a full ward in Utah, right? They all showed up. The church, the pastor, and his congregation, thus, standing together in the dim light, waiting for the redcoats, right, while the stars looked tranquilly down from the sky above them. Once the sound of the battle subsided, 18 Americans lay dead on the Lexington Green, or 18 Americans lay on the Lexington Green, 7 were dead, all from Reverend Clark's church. The teachings of the pulpit of Lexington caused the first blow to be struck for American independence.
Now, most of us have heard about the midnight ride of Paul Revere, right? I mean, we've heard about that for years. The British are coming. The British are coming. April the 18th, 1775. But here's the part of the story that I was never told. When I learned it, it made me mad that someone had not told me in my life. See, that night that Paul Revere was riding through the streets of Lexington yelling the British were coming, he was actually headed to this home. You may be saying, okay, well, who lived there? Well, there was a pastor by the name of Jonas Clark. Jonas Clark was the pastor in Lexington, and that night he had two special guests in his home, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. His wife was cousins with John Hancock, and these two people were in Pastor Clark's house. Hancock and Adams look at Clark. There's Paul Revere sitting in the yard, and they say, okay, well, Pastor Clark, will the men fight? And here's what Pastor Clark said: I trained them for this very hour. They would fight, and if need be, die too, under the shadow of the house of God. And that's exactly what they did. On April the 19th, the very next morning, 1775, Pastor Jonas Clark and John Parker led those citizens out to face the British. There's a stone there today that marks the spot where John Parker said, stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. And that is exactly what happened. Now the British commander rides up to these Minutemen and he says, throw down your arms, you blanking rebels, in the name of the King of England. Guess what they yell back? We recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus. And then the first shot, the shot heard round the world, was fired, and the war for our independence was on. Those men led by Pastor Jonas Clark and Deacon John Parker. When the battle was over and the smoke had cleared, a number of citizens had been killed in that melee, and in fact, Jonas Clark had 7 of his own members lying on the porch of his church who had done just what he said they would do. They died under the shadow of the house of God for your liberty and mine. Now see, these are the stories that make for the history and heritage of our nation. The problem is, though, most of us do not realize. And so as that battle raged all the way from Lexington, all the way across to Concord Bridge, when the thing was over, 49 colonists were killed, 39 wounded. The newspapers of the day talked about the brutality of the British, unprovoked. All of the efforts that they had made to not fight had, of course, as you know, come to no avail. And it was either fight or be subjugated as slaves. In fact, Jonas Clark, when the battle was over, said, from this day will be dated the liberty of the world. And in some respects, Jonas Clark was correct. In fact, a year later, April the 19th, 1776, he preached a message. In those days, they couldn't record them, so they would print them as pamphlets. These are sermons that they used to recruit soldiers for the war effort. Here's the title of that message: The Fate of Bloodthirsty Oppressors and God's Tender Care of His Distressed People. Their titles were longer than most sermons are today. These guys were serious. They weren't playing games. Today at Lexington, there's a statue commemorating those first Minutemen who stood against the British. There's a granite monument with a Bible on top, representing the fact that they were led by their pastor and their deacon, John Parker.
The patriotic preaching of the Reverend Jonas Clark primed those guns, wrote another author. So you see them leading the way in all these instances. Here's another very interesting story. Okay, ministers preached politics and sponsored spinning bees. Okay, so in the historical literature, there are many instances in each of the New England colonies of all-day, what they called spinning bees, held in the rooms and the lawns of the ministers' homes. So the women would all get together, and they would just manufacture clothes. I'm sure they did like soldier uniforms, but it wasn't just that. They were manufacturing clothes for the colonies. The ministers would sponsor contests between, the married versus unmarried, young versus old. They were just they were making it fun, but this was a big deal. And why was it a big deal? So this is going back a little before, Paul Revere's ride, the Stamp Act era, and so about 10 years before that. And what had happened was, when the governor, or when the British Crown, that is, tried to impose the Stamp Act on the colonies, they were boycotting British goods as part of the war effort. So they saw us being economically independent was a way to fight back. From the pulpits in their churches, they urged careful observance of the non-importation agreements. What if you heard in a church today just somebody saying, let's boycott, whatever, right? It would be seen as political speech and like, not something that probably most ministers would be comfortable doing. So, during the war, women were often excused from afternoon service on the Sabbath day to go spinning. The British, they complained about this. In some of their writings, they're just like, what are these Americans doing? They said, Mr. Otis's Black Regiment and his dissenting clergy were also set to work and preach about manufacturing instead of the gospel. They're not even teaching the gospel. They're talking about manufacturing and industry. But to them, that was a way to fight for their liberty. They preached about it until women and children in their homes and outside set their spinning wheel whirling in defiance of Great Britain. That's what the British were saying. So they recognize that action as in defiance of them. So there's some of the history, and depending on time, I might tell a little more later. But so we see the foundation of our nation and the spirit and the attitude that was among the colonists and what they were willing to do and what their leaders were willing to do for what they knew was right. So today, we have a worldwide conspiracy that you're all familiar with if you've been following Defending Utah. This worldwide conspiracy it's just a future version of the ugly British crown, the conspiracy to destroy freedom of the colonists. So they know about what happened during the American Revolution, and they're learning from their mistakes. So they need, before they implement, world communism under the United Nations, they have to get ahead of churches. They don't want an inspirational spirit of people feeling like it's right to not listen to their authority. So in order to get ahead of churches, the modern conspiracy must neutralize this religious influence so they can avoid their past failure. So we're going to go over some examples of how they've done that. Vladimir Lenin said, the best way to control the opposition is to lead it ourselves. Ben, when did he say that? You're the know everything Bircher guy. 1922? And this is a tried and true tactic of communism. And communism, of course, is just an outgrowth of the conspiracy that we're fighting. So the conspiracy wants to get ahead of their church problem. How are they going to neutralize this threat in advance? They've set up scores of globalist religious organizations to influence and change religious culture. They want to replace the doctrine of liberty and obedience to God with obedience to worldly authority under a false peace. You'll notice that this is kind of the exact opposite. It's exactly in opposition to what the preachers in the colonial era of America were preaching. So Romans 13, the 12th article of faith, I'm going to cover that a little bit. And then there's this idea of the rapture cult of changing the idea that they don't want the Christians to fight them again. So they introduced this doctrine. There's we have a whole other presentation on this whole subject, but just briefly, they introduced a doctrine. Was it in London, like late 1800s? Right? Yeah, you can trace it down to where the doctrine came. There's a story of, and some group voted on it. Said, yeah, let's adopt that. But this idea is to say the world is getting so horrible as Christians. That's okay. Jesus is going to save us all, and we won't have to do anything about it. So it's the idea of neutralizing the possibility that Christians would get motivated to do something to defend liberty again. They want to take churches away from being the center of the community. So if you remember in the beginning, I pointed out how they were the center of American life. And they had all this influence because of that. So they've been working to replace that. And in large part with public schools or other government institutions. And then we have this idea of the FEMA clergy response teams. Get the clergy on the side of tyranny well in advance. So let's go over some of these. In my research, just in an hour of Googling, I came up with these are international versions. Some of these are only international organizations. Some of them, like it's an international version of a church that may have been around a very long time. But all of them had UN programs and United Nations ministries that they were working with the UN to implement the UN's goals. The World Council of Churches. We aim to strengthen and enhance UN discourse and practice on issues of peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. And of course, those are UN code words for just global communism. Right? This global ministries, that's the gun in the United Nations. I don't know, is that in New York or is it in Europe? New York, right? For peace, right? Where they show, this is the disarmament statue. But yet this church is promoting that. You would never see that in a church in Lexington. Oh, and also this one mentioned global ministries. Our churches early on sought international peace and in 1945 called for the United Nations. So they're saying that they were part of calling for the United Nations. Okay, so this one, the United Methodist Church and Society organization said, through the ministry, the church joins God in the work of social transformation at the United Nations. And the Episcopal Church has strongly supported the United Nations since before its inception, advocating for its creation in the 1940s. Now, of course, none of this is about any of these individual churches or members of churches and what church anyone has chosen to be in, right? Many beautiful local churches, and I'm going to actually show you some examples of that, but this just shows the international scope of how the global secret combination has linked with all these names and that we're familiar with. The World Baptist Alliance, same thing with their representation at the United Nations. World Federation of Methodist Women, and so all this global church activity under the United Nations. Okay, and then here in Utah, we have kind of conflicting messages. I like more of the messages that I hear, and I'll stand on the ones that I know are right. But this short little clip kind of goes over some of Utah-specific reasons of why we should oppose the United Nations first.
The United Nations has been a tool to undermine our freedoms and the United States Constitution from its very inception. The architects of the UN were men who advocated peace through world tyranny. The Charter's main authors were Americans Alger Hiss and Leo Pazvalsky, and the Soviet Union's Molotov. In addition to co-authoring the UN Charter, Alger Hiss served as Secretary General of the UN's 1945 founding conference in San Francisco. Later, he was exposed as a communist spy for the Soviet Union and a traitor. With communist agents as the framers of the Charter, it is no wonder President J. Reuben Clark of the First Presidency of the Church said, "Perhaps the most striking feature of the Charter is the plainly discernible track of the Great Bear, either by way of express grants of power available and advantageous to him, or by limitations against the exercise of powers by the Charter members, all for the benefit of the bear." In an official statement released by the First Presidency of the Church, and then later printed in pamphlet form, Latter-day Saints were given this warning: "The position of the Church on the subject of communism has never changed. We consider it the greatest satanical threat to peace, prosperity, and the spread of God's work among men that exists on the face of the earth." In light of this statement, any organization set up to favor this satanic threat must be opposed. What else have leaders of the Church said about the UN and its threat to the spread of God's work? Ezra Taft Benson has said this about the UN. The United Nations, planned tyranny. The UN's potential for evil far outweighs its potential for good. The United States is founded on the concept of limited government. The UN concept is one of unlimited government power with virtually no meaningful restraints to protect individual liberty. Police files are full of proven cases of kidnapping and suspected cases of outright murder committed by UN communists where nothing could be done even to question the guilty parties. J. Reuben Clark said, "The Charter is a war document, not a peace document. Our sovereignty is seriously impaired. The Charter provides that the members must make available to the Security Council armed forces, sea, land, and air, as well as other military facilities. If the present plans of the UN shall carry through, they will want our money to pay their bills and want us and our sons to police the world." Marion G. Romney said, "It seems to me that from the inception of the UN, we have had nothing but wars and rumors of wars. These circumstances, however, should not have been unexpected, because communism and all other similar isms, in the words of the First Presidency of the Church, are merely the clumsy counterfeits which Satan always devises of the gospel plan."
Okay, so we have a rich history of opposition to the UN and opposition to communism, but we just have some conflicting messages in modern times, right, that we just have to navigate with the church sponsoring United Nations conferences and partnering with them in certain ways. Now, when you look at this whole globalist influence all under the United Nations, how well coordinated have they been this year? Every single religious leader around the world coordinated in the same actions. I would recommend on also when that United Nations conference came to Salt Lake just a couple of years ago, Defending Utah went there and witnessed it inside, and we put up this website, unitednationsutah.com, and we've got some inside reports where we broadcasted live from inside there and a number of things that happened. So I would just give you a quick plug for that. With all this global influence around the world on churches, there's this fundamental culture change. Christians in the colonial area, and our doctrine today still says that we have conditional obedience to government only. We obey constitutionally sound government that protects rights. We do not obey unconstitutional government. God gives us a right and duty to resist. This was taught for hundreds of years by the clergy before the American Revolution. They want to change this to unconditional obedience to government. Obey all things the government says under all conditions. Resist illegal government actions only through the government. And this is all newly taught by public schools and now many modern churches. Here's a great video. Let's turn the audio up again, Micah.
It really wasn't essential whether the Caesar was a homosexual, a pedophile, a mother murderer, or a good man. The law is the same. There is no place for rebellion and resistance, because to do so is to resist God.
That is an absolutely absurd position. People look at that and they say, oh, Romans 13, we've got it. God is said that government is ordained of him. And yes, government is ordained of God. For God governs the universe. But it is absurd to think that government, all government, was created by God.
And we as Christian citizens submit to the governmental authority. We submit ourselves, and refusal to submit constitutes resisting the authority of God.
And while the king's men in charge of executing judgment upon them, they were killed, the 3 Hebrews were left unharmed, protected in their rebellion against the government by the hands of God.
I would cite you to the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government, because God has ordained the government for his purposes.
The key distinction is how you define the law. If they exceed the boundaries of the consensual authority, then those things that they say are no longer law. They are simply the statements of a robber.
We believe in being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates, and obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law.
Okay, we're going to clarify the 12th article of faith on the next slide. But when you see all those other preachers, the things they're saying that are, they're just so blatant. The false doctrine today seems to be exactly calculated to oppose the very things that the early American ministers taught. Because they want to prevent the people from ever standing for liberty. They've got to get it in our brains and in our culture that somehow that's always wrong. If you want to see the full video, we actually did a short mini documentary. It's 40 minutes long on this exact subject on our YouTube channel. It's called Must Christians Obey the Government? What you just saw was actually the first 2-minute intro of that film. But I'm going to take one more clip from that film. I'm going to walk through the 12th article of faith and show a common misunderstanding is that it means, the satanic doctrine we just heard of always obeying everything we hear from the health department, from anything, whatever. If the government said it, the governor said it, that's law, we obey. That's the satanic counterfeit. But we're just going to kind of show how that common misunderstanding comes into play. And it's actually very simple reading. And then you'll see the 12th article of faith actually is exactly in line with the founder's perspective, that we believe in conditional obedience to our leaders when they are following the Constitution. So, turn the video up again.
Apostle Rutger Clausen said, quote, "I have only this to say why judgment should not be passed upon me. I very much regret that the laws of my country should come in conflict with the laws of God. But whenever they do, I shall invariably choose to obey the latter." Now, how could there be such a disconnect between the 12th article of faith and other scriptures? Could it be a simple grammatical misunderstanding and not actually a contradiction? This particular article of faith is commonly misread to include a coordinating conjunction that is not actually found and which dramatically changes its meaning when added. Most quote the 12th article of faith to read, "We believe in being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates, and in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law." The coordinating conjunction, though, and, however, does not exist in the actual text. This is important because grammatically, the coordinating conjunction changes the meaning of this passage. In the English language, there are 7 coordinating conjunctions. Those are and, but, or, nor, for, so, and yet. These coordinating conjunctions are used to join 2 separate complete sentences into one. Let's give an example. Jack went to a baseball game and Jill practiced piano. Independently, Jack went to a baseball game is a complete sentence, as is Jill practiced piano. However, by using the coordinating conjunction and, we are allowed to splice these 2 complete clauses together into one sentence. The 12th article of faith, on the other hand, has no coordinating conjunction. This means that there is only one complete sentence and not 2 clauses. By adding a coordinating conjunction, we change the meaning of the 12th article of faith to have 2 separate clauses, being one, that we believe in being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates, and 2, we believe in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. This, however, is not the way the article is written. Instead, the 12th article of faith reads, "We believe in being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law." Without the coordinating conjunction, the belief of being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates is actually qualified in this single clause by their obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. Our belief in being subject to these leaders only goes so far as they obey, honor, and sustain the law. Without the coordinating conjunction, the qualifying obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law is applied to the leaders and not to the people themselves.
Let's talk about the center of the community, right? In early American life, this depicts really well, right? The churches is where people gathered and listened and learned. There was the center of their life, and that kind of foundational culture was part of the DNA that created the American Revolution and won it. So to get ahead of that, I'm going to show you a picture, and this is a brand new state-of-the-art fancy everything place, right? And the community voted on it. The community voted to say, right, they want to take this government institution, make it cooler, better, so that kids just want to be there more and more all the time, and take more activities away from anywhere else, the churches, ideally, from the conspiracies perspective, and bring more activities here. In fact, the conspiracy would like to feed your children 3 times a day. They want them there all day long. They're going to give them fun stuff to do, and I'm sure they'll start putting beds in whenever the people are willing to accept that. School districts serving three meals a day through quarantine. Utah, we have the child nutrition program doing the same thing. When we vote, we think we're voting for our kids, like, yeah, we should vote for that. We should raise taxes for their education. That's a good thing. You're just voting, right, to help the conspiracy's plan to make the schools bigger and bigger and the center of American life. Corner Canyon High School, they have this huge football stadium. I think half the high schools now in the state have massive football stadiums like that, like their NFL, professionals, and they're just upgrading them more and more. Okay, and then the next subject, FEMA clergy response teams. Now this is a subject I would caution about because they are real, but the internet is full of misinformation and exaggeration. So be cautious in Googling this term. I think the reason there's so much misinformation is because it's intentional clouding of this subject so that if you do Google it, it starts to look like it's out there, and then you're like, oh no, that's not a thing. But it is a thing, and so I'm going to show you a couple real sources and talk briefly about it. Okay? Pastor Chuck Baldwin, and so these are a couple articles I found that get into this subject. He has a website, American Pastors Network. He talks about this subject. You can Google that, look that up. And then on the right here, a periodical I found, Journal of Homeland Security Emergency Management, where they discuss the role of pastors in disaster curriculum development. So preparing faith-based leaders to be agents of safety. So it shows, their internal memos and their own writings that aren't on other websites, but they're just professional writings they have. They want to prepare faith-based leaders to be their agents during emergencies. This is a government program to have clergy, quote, help with public when dealing with emergency situations. So you can imagine, panic, the public saying, we're not going to take the shot, this is ridiculous. Well, they would love the pastors to get up and say, it's okay, just take it for now. Whatever they have to say, to calm them down. That's the hope. The hope of this program is to get religious leaders to just parrot their line. This is also related to another program called InfraGard. It's similar in that the clergy response teams are more, for ministers and religious, whereas InfraGard is the government dealing with industry. And so they'll go to manufacturing, they'll go to tech industry, they'll go just different industries, and they sign people up to feel special. I actually worked at the LDS Church of the IT department in 2012. And FBI someone thought it was a good idea to have the FBI come in and give a talk to a bunch of IT employees and try to recruit us all into InfraGard. And so this FBI guy is in front of this room of all these engineers, and he's saying all these wonderful things. Look at all this data we have. You can get all this data firsthand and help us find terrorists and bad guys, and just making us feel special. And it was actually a very awkward meeting, because I think most of the people in that room were closer to where I was constitutionally. And one guy actually raised his hand and said, "So, sir, what do you think of the constitutionality of sharing all this data with us?" And he was just like, "Well," and he just stammered, and he goes, "I don't know." Like, that was the only answer he had. Like, he wasn't expecting someone to like question, like, why wouldn't you want to feel special and be part of our program, right? So that was interesting. So, all right, on the clergy response teams, this is a bit of a longer clip, but I thought it was a really good one, and really helps drive home kind of some of the reality and some personal testimony of this pastor in Arizona. Now, he's particularly, this is a clip from a video where he's talking to his congregation about what he sees are modern changes in the Bible. So if you remember, when we went back to that last video that said satanic doctrine taught in churches on the government, they mentioned Romans 13. So here, this pastor, he also covers Romans 13 a little bit, and he's showing how modern reprints of the Bible are changing the verse. But then he's also going to talk about the clergy response teams.
But not only do these new versions contain a lot of crazy things that make the Bible look foolish, they also have a very specific agenda to prepare people for the New World Order. And part of that preparation is to convince Christians to obey the government no matter what. The key passage that they've tampered with is Romans 13.
I'm free to make myself a slave. I'm free to give up some of my freedom. I'm free, but I'm free to submit to the authority of my government. Even bad governments do God's work by keeping even a semblance of order in the streets. Even the government of the Soviet Union under Stalin was doing work for God. Even China under Mao Zedong was doing work for God. Honor the king. Do it anyway, whether the king deserves it or not. Honor your governor. Honor your mayor, whether or not they deserve it. Honor the king.
No one will be able to be armed. We will take all weapons.
Today in New Orleans, they got a lot tougher on the holdouts.
Police department, everyone home!
Not only the flooded areas, but New Orleans' driest and wealthiest neighborhoods too.
But gun confiscation is exactly what happened during the state of emergency following Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. U.S. troops also arrived. Easing public fears and quelling dissent would be critical. And that's exactly what the clergy response team, as it's called, helped accomplish in New Orleans.
The primary thing that we say to anybody is let's cooperate and get this thing over with, and then we'll settle the differences once the crisis is over.
Such clergy response teams would walk a tightrope between the needs of the government versus the wishes of the public. For the clergy, one of the biggest tools that they will have in helping calm the public down or obey the law is the Bible itself, specifically Romans 13.
Because the government is established by the Lord. And that's what we believe in the Christian faith. That's what's stated in the Scripture.
But wait a minute. What if a police officer just comes to my house and says, "Wash my car, slave"? Does the Bible require me to obey that? No. Okay, what if a police officer asked me to do something illegal? I mean, what if a policeman came to me and said, "You know what? I want you to climb over the fence into your neighbor's house, and I want you to look through the window and see what your neighbor's doing. I want you to spy on your neighbor for me." I mean, do I have to obey that? Or what if you say, you're picking stupid examples. Right, because there's never been a government anywhere that commanded people to spy on their neighbors or else. That's never happened. Right? There's no such thing as Nazi Germany. There's no such thing as the Soviet Union. Just shut up and obey what you're told. Romans 13 is a passage that explains to us the purpose of government is to punish evildoers. Not to regulate every aspect of our lives and tell us what to do and control us. But also a key thing that is taught in Romans 13 is that we are to obey the higher powers. So for example, in the United States, we have various levels of government, don't we? Now, what is the supreme law of our land? Well, first of all, it's God's law. First, we obey God. After that is the Constitution of the United States, because the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land. You say, well, the Bible says to honor the king, therefore we need to obey Obama. Well, hold on a second. Is Obama the king? Is our government run as a monarchy? And I thought that we have elected officials that answer to the people and that they are not above the law, and that the supreme law of the land is the U.S. Constitution. So if we're going to obey the government that has been set up over us, if we're to obey the law of the land, that means we're supposed to obey the Constitution. The NIV just completely eliminates that teaching. It doesn't teach you to go with the higher power. It just says this: everyone must submit to governing authorities. So instead of saying, you know, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, there's no power but of God, the powers that be are ordained of God, just referring to the fact that no one on this earth has any legitimate authority except coming from God. Why do children have to obey their parents? Because God said so. Why do we obey human government at all? Why do we even have any respect for human government? Because God told us that human government is something that we need to punish evildoers, to protect the innocent from those that would harm them. Here's the New Living Translation in Romans 13:1. Everyone must submit to the governing authorities, for all authority comes from God. Watch this. And those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. Now that is not true. The New Living Translation is saying that everyone in any position of authority has been placed there by God. That is not true. Because one day, the Antichrist is going to be placed in authority by Satan. The dragon gave him his authority, it says in Revelation 13. And not only that, but in Hosea, it says they've set up kings, but not by me. There are times when human authority has been placed there by man against the will of God. And so therefore the New Living Translation is saying in verse 6, pay your taxes too for the same reasons. For government workers need to be paid. They're serving God in what they do. Give to them what you owe them. Pay your taxes and government fees to those who collect them. Good night. Now it's not just the tax, it's also the fees. And those are the worst. The King James is telling you to obey government within a certain scope, within certain parameters of what their job is, what they're supposed to be doing. And also the whole concept of higher powers is there as a check and balance. And the pastors of America are the ones that ought to be shouting and screaming the loudest, freedom! Freedom! We ought to be telling the truth about what's going on. But today, in many cases, it's the pastors and pulpits of America that are parroting the government line. The FEMA, thank you, the FEMA pastors. You say, I don't know if I really think that that's real, that whole, FEMA pastors. And, I know personally of big mega church pastors that I've known who have said they were contacted and literally brought to the White House and sat down in a meeting with George W. Bush and given their marching orders for what to preach and what they needed to say and what they needed to do. I could tell you, I know it for a fact. You may not think that that's going on. But you know what? They're not stupid. They know that the preachers of America and the pastors of churches have the ear of millions and millions and millions of people across this land. And they have corrupted the pastors of America. They have turned them into government prostitutes of propaganda across the land. It's true. They are hirelings. And I'm going to tell you something. They literally, I'm sure that some of them are just ignorant and maybe their heart's in the right place, but that stupid television has just brainwashed them, or maybe they just don't have time to read this book because they're too busy reading some, feel-good book from the Christian bookstore that's going to tell them about God instead of reading the Holy Bible and figuring out what's really going on. Come on. Come on, read the Bible. How many times? The whole book of Acts is people getting thrown in jail and breaking out of jail. That's the whole book. Almost every chapter somebody's going to jail. All throughout the Old Testament, they're fighting against wickedness, and they're fighting against tyranny and oppression. And they're being enslaved because of their unrighteousness, and they're losing freedom. But today, preachers want to preach a feel-good sermon. They literally will parade the police chief and every government mayor,
governors, mayors, congressmen, good or bad, they'll parade them across the platform and say, we appreciate your service. I'm not saying that there aren't good people serving in those positions. But to indiscriminately praise our government, unbelievable. We ought to have pastors that are getting in the pulpit and telling people the truth. This freedom movement that's sweeping across America, and it is. In the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a movement of freedom sweeping across this nation. And let me tell you something. It's often been known as the truth movement. Have you heard that before? You've heard it called the truth movement? Because let me tell you something. The two go hand in hand. When you're listening to liars, you'll never be free. When you're being lied to, it doesn't matter whether you can vote if everything you're voting on is a lie. And everything that you've been told about the candidates is a lie. And everything you believe about what they're going to do when they get elected is all a lie. That's not freedom.
So that's interesting how, there's several interesting things about that whole thing, right? He had a lot of personal experience with these other pastors. They've been flown to Washington, D.C., where the president spoke to pastors and said, here's what we need you to do. So I think that there were kind of several points there that really illustrate that. And the earlier part of the video showed Hurricane Katrina. That was 2005, I believe. In the wake of that, how there was a gun confiscation exercise where they took the guns from everyone in, New Orleans. That was the city, right? They used clergy. They were interviewing the clergy there on a mainstream news station, explaining how they were trying to help the government just do what they need to do for now. So that's a thing, is just what it comes down to. And when he mentioned how, there's this truth movement, and isn't it interesting, there's a movement of freedom sweeping across the nation. Well, this video was kind of taken in the era post 9/11. So it's interesting how there's ups and downs. Like right now, I feel like there's this truth movement coming. New people jumping into activism. Feels like a new wave, a new revival. Well, we just came out of a slump that before that was this past revival, which he's talking about. After 9/11, we're losing more freedoms. The TSA is in, right? All this fake terrorism as much as the fake pandemic we're dealing with now. And so all this fear, right? And things are changing, but then people started to get slowly used to it. The freedom movement dies down. So it kind of goes in these waves. Okay, so we've kind of covered all these things, right? The conspiracy is getting ahead of their church problem so that they don't have another black robe regiment that they have to deal with. Because they learned in colonial America that they lose to that. So if they lose to that, wouldn't it be nice to actually have that in these days? So I went out looking, kind of went outside my comfort zone, and I was kind of looking around for other churches. I'm like, where are there some good preachers talking about this stuff? You just saw one example, right? Pastor Stephen Anderson. He's in Tempe, Arizona. But here's just a handful I found, right? Outside my own neighborhood. I went to Heber, Utah. I personally heard this guy talk. I was like, what? I heard a rumor there's a church they're not wearing masks. I'm like, great, I want to go see what's going on there. I'm sure there's lots more, for sure. I'm sure there's tons of them, but I just found a few, right? Yeah. And so this guy, Pastor Greg Locke, he like during the pandemic, like flipped a switch, and he was giving all these sermons on not putting up with the nonsense. And he has like an Instagram channel. I was following a bunch of his videos. Chuck Baldwin's been around for a long time. Dan Fisher, he's the guy you saw in some of my earlier videos. In fact, I'm going to show him again here in just a second. So these are just some examples. I'm sure there's tons of them, but they're mostly, I would expect, smaller churches. And even a bigger church could have, a local minister who personally feels like doing the right thing, right? So no matter how big or small your church is, all that matters is, can we influence our immediate leaders that have the ears of our congregation to talk about liberty and rights in the proper context? I am going to use these bonus stories. I wasn't sure how long this presentation would be, so I figured I could skip them if I was going too long. But I think we have plenty of time.
Now here's a Baptist preacher by the name of James Screven. He's known in history as General James Screven. He was a pastor in Georgia. He was a member of the Provincial Congress that met in 1775. He joined the Colonial Army once the war broke out. He started as a colonel. Later on, the state of Georgia promoted him to brigadier general of the entire Georgia militia. At the Battle of Spencer Hill, he was ambushed and he was wounded 2 times. And while he was lying on the field dying, a British soldier walked up and saw that he was still alive, took his musket, pointed down at him, and shot him again while he was lying on the ground. See, the British hated these preachers. They hated them so much that if they caught them, they would normally execute them on the battlefield. If they could find their families, they would either throw them into prison or execute them. They would burn their houses, burn their churches. Did you know the majority of churches in New York City were burned by the British when they occupied New York? They hated these Christians because they knew that they were the reason. Well, they took his body back, buried him outside his church in Midway, Georgia. Congress erected his tombstone, and I think it's kind of interesting to see what Congress wrote. This stone marks the spot where repose the remains of Brigadier General James Screven, in recognition of whose life and services the Congress of the United States has reared a monument in this cemetery. He was a gallant officer who, though but 28 years of age at the time of his death, had attained the rank of Brigadier General. Baptist Pastor James Screven. Here's Joab Houghton. He's another pastor from New Jersey. Here's what he said when he heard about the fight at Lexington in '75. This is what he said to his congregation. This is not the men of the city, this is his church. He said, "Men of New Jersey, the redcoats are murdering our brethren of New England. Who follows me to Boston?" His men went home, got their muskets. He went and got his, and the pastor led his men to Boston and joined the fight. Are you beginning to see the kind of heritage that we've inherited? Now then, he would preach to troops from Ticonderoga to Valley Forge when they were facing the bitter winter there. But it wasn't just pastors, it was deacons from the same church. One deacon led the infantry at the Battle of Long Island. The same church produced another deacon that commanded the artillery at Germantown. I mean, over and over and over.
So I love the moment where the preacher says, "Our brothers are being murdered by redcoats. Who's going to follow me to Boston?" You know, last year, during the fake pandemic, there was a lady who couldn't even see her baby, and her baby died in the hospital. What we should have seen is elders, who's going down to primary children's and walking through those doors with 50 elders doing the right thing, restoring a mother to her child. Dozens of examples of that last year, of things where we should have stood up. I say the men, I mean, we all can stand up, but I see myself as men, we have a duty to stand up. Anyway, so many opportunities there were last year. But if we need to rekindle this culture, this understanding, and this testimony of true doctrine, to know when it's righteous to protect liberty. Here's this next guy, Samuel West.
This is a sermon by Samuel West. Now I want you to notice who he's preaching to. He's preaching to the House of Representatives of the state of Massachusetts. This is an election sermon. Now this is just a portion of it, but this will give you a flavor of how these guys preach. Look at what he says. "It is an indispensable duty, my brethren, which we owe to God and our country, to rouse up and bestir ourselves, and being animated with a noble zeal for the sacred cause of liberty, to defend our lives and fortunes to the shedding of the last drop of blood. The love of our country, the tender affection that we have for our wives and children, and the regard that we ought to have for unborn posterity, yea, everything that is dear and sacred, do now loudly call on us to use our best endeavors to save our country. We must turn our plowshares into swords and our pruning hooks into spears, and learn the art of self-defense against our enemies. To be careless and remiss, or to neglect the cause of our country through the base motives of avarice or self-interest, will expose us not only to the resentments of our fellow creatures, but to the displeasure of Almighty God.
To save our country from the hands of our oppressors ought to be dearer to us than our lives, and next to the eternal salvation of our souls, the thing of greatest importance. A duty so sacred it cannot be dispensed with for the sake of our secular concerns. Doubtless for this reason, God has manifested His anger against those who have refused to assist their country against its cruel oppressors. And then here's how he ends this. What a dreadful doom are those exposed to who have not only refused to assist their country in this time of distress, but have, through motives of interest or ambition, shown themselves enemies to their country by opposing us in the measures we have taken. He that is so lost to humanity as to be willing to sacrifice his country for the sake of avarice or ambition has arrived at the highest stage of wickedness that human nature is capable of, and deserves a much worse name than I at present care to give him. But I think I may with propriety say that such a person has forfeited his right to human society. Can you imagine? Can you imagine a preacher preaching that this Sunday from his pulpit? But that's what these people heard all of the time.
Religious and civil liberties are connected. Even here in Utah, our major local church has an app, and they have topics, gospel topics, religious freedom and citizenship. They're saying, and they're still telling us this very day, to stand for religious liberty. That is impossible without civil liberty. Studying the Constitution and putting all these together, there's no other way. The problem is, the understanding. If you want to speak up for religious liberty, or if it's for civil liberty and people say that's inappropriate here, you should be armed with the knowledge to explain them, no, there is no religious liberty unless we protect the civil liberty of others and ourselves, and we don't volunteer our rights away. So some challenges. Share the doctrine of liberty with others at your churches. And join with those then that you talk about. Build a fire in the hearts of your preachers, your bishops, your ministers, religious leaders of any kind. Help them see, help them have a testimony of why this is so important until they love it as much as you do. Let them know that you expect far more from them. And then I'd invite you to join Defending Utah. Join, build your own understanding of these concepts, of the conspiracy and the enemy that we talk about so much, and what we're for and how to stand for what's right. And then build a chapter or head a community committee for your area. And that's all. Thank you.